Okay, students, we'll see if this works. I have myself set up outside, where the outside fireplace is at our house. And I'm going to do a lecture related to Chapter 8, getting most of it accomplished, but I think I'll record a second one and post it later, probably tomorrow actually, for the latter part of the chapter that does have a lot of really important information in it concerning crisis intervention and military service members who are experiencing what this author talks about as being invisible wounds of war. And so here we're talking again a little bit about PTSD. We're also talking about traumatic brain injury, depression, suicide, all those kinds of crises that you might end up helping a military service member with. So it's a good place to start often in these kinds of things to think about the history of something. And so, we talk about PTSD as kind of a modern condition that our service members develop, but actually a form of PTSD has probably been around for a very long time. So even in the Civil War, we had soldiers who came back from war who had disturbances in their thinking and their relationships with others. They had depression, a lack of functionality, and in those days that was referred to as a soldier's heart. And there's actually a book that my children read, I think in maybe 3rd or 5th grade, called A Soldier's Heart. And it was kind of about that, about war wounds experienced by soldiers in the Civil War. And then, of course, in World War I and World War II, you heard the phrase shell shock, which was another description of, the kinds of impairments that soldiers, not all soldiers, but some soldiers came home with, and it was thought to be related to shock. Moving on through history, when the Vietnam War, or the Vietnam conflict, whatever it's called, happened, many soldiers came back from Vietnam. Those people are now in their mid-70s, and they had no real, it was such an unpopular war that they had a terrible welcome home and no real support really from our community in America, and there were not services available for them, psychological services really available for them. And so those people, that was also trauma from war that they experienced. And I'm trying to remember, it might be that, it could be that PTSD was coined as a phrase coming out of the years after the Vietnam War. And then your book, your author has had a special interest in military service members from Operation Iraqi Freedom and the other war. These were 2 conflicts that we entered into after 9/11. And she herself has worked with many veterans of those conflicts and their PTSD war wounds. She actually has even developed a type of therapy called sand tray therapy that she's used for helping service members. So Christy Cannell has been a little bit of a leader since the early 2000s in helping soldiers with their war trauma. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, I think. Well, what were soldiers told to do to deal with their psychological stresses, and how are soldiers trained? Well, I'm not really an expert on any of that, but I do know that, soldiers are trained to be brave, to be courageous, to stuff down fear, to not be driven by fear, and things like bravery and integrity and commitment are values that are taught to our service members. They're great values. It is what creates a warrior culture, really, and there's nothing wrong with that, except that, if a soldier comes back, a military member comes back, and they have, stress reactions and acute stress disorders and maybe even PTSD developing, then these kinds of values can sometimes prevent them from feeling like it's okay to say, hey, I'm not doing well, I need some help. And so in about 2010, a researcher named Hoge, Hoge, sort of gave this some thought and decided to develop some sort of a manualized training and intervention program for soldiers that would, instead of trying to stop those kinds of values, would integrate those values of bravery and courage and integrity and commitment and honor. And so there's a very interesting short description of his method, if you will, and it's on page 154 of your textbook. It's referred to with the acronym of LAND NAV, like land navigation. I love that, and it's a pretty cool program. I wish I had my book outside with me, and I might hit some of the highlights of what the elements of that program are. But pay attention to it. I think there's a test question related to this, actually, in our book. Hold on, let me change my notes here. So also in your textbook is some interesting literature developed by a different researcher who started to think about what is the effect on human beings of killing other human beings. And so Grossman in 1995 devised this understanding, and the whole purpose of kind of investigating this and devising this understanding of what it does to us to kill other people during war, which in fact is what war is about and military service is often about, is to understand the reactions that people have to doing this task, and that it affects the psyche of the human mind. And so the Grossman delineated 5 different stages of understanding what it felt like to service members to have to kill. So the first stage is actually the killing itself, and then it goes on. There are 5 of these stages, by the way, to a sense of exhilaration. Sometimes that exhilaration could be, related to being not a victim and not being killed oneself, but being the one who, does have success over an enemy, actually. And then, of course, people feel remorse over that. Some soldiers that I've listened to talk about, feeling like they can remember every single person, the face, if they could see it, of every single person that they killed during their military service. And that's a pretty big burden. And the task during war is to, make the mission successful. And sometimes, of course, the mission being successful has to do with, killing other people, killing enemy combatants. Then there's the stage of rationalization about why this killing had to happen and, why it was part of the mission. And then finally, acceptance. And so using this understanding of these 5 stages of how military service members experience having to kill helps the military service member, because it's a stepwise examination of their reaction to killing. It also reduces some of the shame and stigma that they might feel having had to do this task, and feeling maybe like a counselor or a crisis worker might not really understand what that's all about. And so this sort of shared language about these 5 stages of killing helps a military service member, be able to bond with a crisis worker, and hopefully the crisis worker can communicate a sense of understanding, what this is like and why it has to be done, and sort of unburdening, the soldier unburdening him or herself of talking out each one of these stages of killing can be, quite a relief, and reduce some of the stress and acute stress reaction or depression or feelings of suicidality that can come from, coming home from military service and having to integrate back into a world where killing is not a part of your job, and, understanding that a lot of people around you might not really get that was your job. And so you can see, if we start to think about this, the kind of relief and crisis intervention that even examining the stages of killing with a client could perhaps, give this relief. So take a look at that in your textbook. I think I've explained it in, most of the detail, but if you're curious about it, you could look up and Google Grossman's 1995 study on the stages of killing and probably read some more articles and hear more about it. Maybe there are even some clips on YouTube concerning this. I'm not sure. Well, let's move on to part 3 of the lecture outline, which is, just an introduction to the concept of what invisible wounds are. And before I get started with that, I'm just going to double check that the camera's continuing to record, so hang on there. Yeah, so it seems like we're still going at about 11 minutes into the lecture. So these invisible wounds, I think it's good. It's I think, to consider and conceptualize the kinds of disorders that can develop from being a service member, and the way that they're combat wounds. And this is not a light thing to talk about or consider, because reframing, helping a soldier reframe their stress, their PTSD, their depression, their anxiety, their reactions that are not helping them function, to reframe these as combat wounds, versus maybe mental health weaknesses or mental illness, is a pretty big reframe, if you ask me. And so I love the concept of using this language of invisible wounds, but that these invisible wounds are absolutely combat wounds. It is interesting in these recent military conflicts that we've been involved with, that the way of fighting and conducting war, if you will, with terrorists is, by them using IEDs and roadside bombs and, other kinds of explosive devices that cause, traumatic brain injury, also lead to the development of PTSD. And so, these are different kinds of wounds in general than wounds of other wars, where people might have lost a leg, or be a double amputee, or lost another kind of appendage, or some other kind of terrible physical gut opening war wound. These more recent wounds from these more recent conflicts are due to explosions, and that's something I don't know if you've given much thought to, but a lot of the people who served in Iraq that are needing service at their veterans mental health centers are people who have experienced these kinds of things. And so this whole concept of invisible wounds being combat injuries, but even if they don't look like physical injuries necessarily, the fact that they are physical injuries can be a good way to start this conversation with a military service member who might be in crisis and you might be talking to. So I want to talk a little bit about PTSD and rates of PTSD, and looking a little bit at depression and some of those kinds of things. So when, the studies that are cited, at least in our textbook, are, from 2014, 2016, a little bit in that range, maybe 2017. So a recent estimate from the textbook for PTSD, rates of PTSD in service members, seems to be between about 13% up to about 20%. And these kind of rates of experiencing these disorders are, kind of in that range, if you will. I'll be talking about some other numbers like that as we go along here. So one of the things that happens, of course, with PTSD, there are several kinds of experiences that the person has. And PTSD is a post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if you think about the name of that, as we've talked about it before in other chapters actually, you understand that this is a trauma injury And so some of the experiences that people have, the symptoms is the word I was looking for, are re-experiencing symptoms. Re-experiencing symptoms. So an example of that could be nightmares, re-experiencing traumatic, the traumatic event over and over and over again, and waking up, with nightmares. Also, flashbacks can be a part of this re-experiencing behavior. Violent nightmares. I've heard wives talk about their, husbands waking up and being really dangerous next to them in the bed. Not really, of course, being aware of the fact that they're at home and they're safe, but this can be really frightening. Also, hypervigilance, always being on edge, always being ready for some, terrible event to be happening, sort of being just on edge all the time, is another example of, reactions that people have when they're having PTSD. Some other statistics report that 9% of males and females might report symptoms like this sort of shortly after returning from service. And an interesting thing that happens is that after about a year, that same number or that same group of people in a study reported themselves at 31% of experiencing these post-traumatic disorder symptoms. So 9% just immediately after coming home, but after a year, the development rises to about 31%. And this is worrisome, it really is. I can't imagine the emotional toll that it takes on a family and a marriage and partnerships and business partnerships and people in their employment when they come home and they're, just trying to be reintegrated into our culture, and get back to work and be a parent again and be a partner in life again. And then to have this development of these reactivity symptoms, I just can't imagine what that would be like. I think it would be terrible. And, this is why it's important for us to think about what service members experience and the kinds of needs that they have if we might meet them in a crisis intervention situation. I'll tell a very quick story. I think I may have mentioned this to you before, but at Sandhills we have a high rate of military veterans who come back and choose to attend school here, and because they're living in Aberdeen and Cameron and Pinehurst and Southern Pines and all these towns around us, and so they choose to attend school at Sandhills, and we're really proud of the fact that they choose us, and we try very hard at Sandhills to have a welcoming atmosphere to veterans. We have people on staff that are, paid staff, very highly trained staff, to be available to serve our military veterans. And so, we as professors get training off and on about how to manage sometimes, disruptions that could possibly happen in the classroom, not always, for sure, but, people who are coming back with traumatic brain injury or PTSD are possibly going to have some behaviors in a classroom and some effects from their injuries that are going to, make the learning environment a difficult environment from time to time. So I just want to mention that we have this sensitivity to that. I have heard and seen people, who are military service members have disruptive events happen in classrooms that look really frightening. They're loud, they're full of bad language, they might throw things, or they might knock a table over, they might stalk out of a classroom. And you can imagine that for a lot of us that kind of behavior is not typical for a college classroom, and so that can be a little bit disruptive for students of all sorts to be involved with that and to be in a classroom where that happens. Moving on to talk about this sort of development of PTSD, Vietnam veterans. Remember, these are baby boomers, really, at the older end of the baby boomer era, if you will. They report a lifetime occurrence for PTSD of about 31%. That's pretty high. I mean, if you have 10 people, that's that's 3 out of 10, and that's disturbing for sure. The other sad thing I think that we all know is that when Vietnam veterans returned back from war, they did not receive good interventions. Although I have to say, support groups, back then they called them rap groups, where people would come into a room and rap or talk, is what that used to be, meaning were just self-help groups that Vietnam veterans sort of developed on their own, and they did find that these rap groups or support groups were super, super helpful in sharing feelings, receiving support, talking with people who are there, who really understand it, who really, put their boots on the ground and their life on the line. And so, aside from rap groups and perhaps some medications being offered, Vietnam veterans really did not receive a lot of support in the form of mental illness from mental illness counseling and support from the U.S. government. Let me check let me check the camera again. Okay, still running. It cut off on me yesterday, so I have to keep watching it. Moving on to another type of invisible wound, I want to talk about depression and suicide. And this is a very big topic, especially for Operation Iraqi Freedom and the other one, I can't think of the name of that other acronym for the Iraqi war. But the statistic right now is that about 22 veterans from those conflicts commit suicide every day in America. That's really a serious matter. And so here we're going to talk a little bit about suicide and depression, which are also, interventions that you might need to do as a crisis worker or any kind of human services worker, actually, helping a veteran who's suffering with depression or, suicidal ideation. So some of the problems that a client might come to you and talk about that they're having that could be, you would hear them as symptoms, are things like an appetite change, not wanting to eat or losing their appetite, psychomotor retardation. So think about that phrase, psychomotor retardation. This would refer to, slowness of processing things, feeling like your thinking is just really slowed down. Also lethargy, just, physical lethargy, just low energy, not wanting to move, the idea maybe of going out for a run or a brisk walk for mental health just might feel like a ridiculous suggestion to someone who's experiencing psychomotor retardation. It's just not the energy level maybe that they might have. Also agitation, suicidal thoughts. There's a whole laundry list of these in my notes. Sleep problems, of course, sleeping too much or sleeping not enough. Feelings of guilt, feelings of worthlessness, loss of energy, feeling just remorse and regret, and just sort of a general loss of interest in life. And you can imagine, for someone who's trying to live their life as a returned military service member, that all of that long laundry list of symptoms would be pretty darn hard to live with, even if you only had 2 or 3 of them, let alone the whole, list that I read out. And so this is not a very high quality life for a person to live with. And if someone, you end up doing crisis intervention with someone and you find out that they were a military service member, this invisible wound of these kinds of symptoms, the other symptoms that we were talking about that could be PTSD related, are really more anxiety-based symptoms. These are more depression-based symptoms. And so, you have to get your brain actively thinking about, what am I hearing? What kinds of descriptions is this person giving to me about the feelings that they're having? What does this look like? Female veterans, going on with my notes, female veterans have a risk which is 2.4 times higher than just general population females for depression and suicidality. In the next lecture that I'll record and post on for Wednesday, we're going to talk a little bit about military sexual trauma, which is not only germane to female military service members, but is primarily a part of what happens to them, or can happen to them. Suicidal ideations and feelings and completions are a really significant invisible wound for military service members, and so I think I've made some good points about that with you in this part of the lecture. Problems with anger. This is another kind of category that your textbook, that Christy Cannell, kind of separates out. And this can show up as hostility and aggression, but it is related to PTSD. Impulsive aggression is overrepresented in these kinds of service members. Premeditated aggression, so she talks about impulsive aggression and anger and rage, and then she also talks about premeditated aggression. Those are two different things if you think about it. These particular aspects of PTSD can be very much helped by some of the therapies that are described in this textbook. I just posted for you a YouTube clip that is about the neurology and neurological feedback. I think it's called neurofeedback, maybe, and it is applied in that particular film clip to people who are having problems with rage and aggression and fighting and losing their jobs and that kind of thing. So this sort of form of neurobiofeedback is a great little clip to watch. I think it's about 10 minutes long, and I would recommend that you watch it because it does show two military service members of different wars and how they describe how they felt, and also how the neurofeedback is lessening their anxiousness and calming their brain. And that's so fascinating. In fact, I got so interested in it that I searched for a reliable article about how that works and what the research shows and how that was developed. It's kind of fascinating, actually. So another problem that can happen is misuse of alcohol, and I think I'm going to turn off the camera and start a new film clip, and we'll talk about misuse of alcohol and I think traumatic brain injury, and that will end this portion of my recording.